Hi, good afternoon. Sorry, late this afternoon. Okay, so last time we focused on the position of Maimonides. We looked in depth at his view, and we used the image that he developed of the development of the oral law as one where we have a tree and branches. If you remember, we spoke at great length. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvot uses the image of, you have the roots which are divinely given, which include the written law and the explanation of the written law. Alongside that, at the same time, and that's what he calls the Perushim HaMekubalim, alongside that, inherent in the text is the ability for the rabbis, given the proper training and the proper midot, the proper principles that they inherited from Sinai, to use to interpret the text and draw out new interpretations and new ideas. And that's what the Rambam calls the anafim, the branches, and eventually the fruit, which comes out. And so that's the structure for the Rambam. On the other hand, the Rambam takes the position that the Torah Shebaal Peh is all included under the prohibition of lo tasur min hadavar sheyagidu lecha yamin u'smol. It says in chapter 17 of the book of Deuteronomy that you should follow whatever the rabbis say. And therefore, whatever the rabbis say includes even the things that they themselves have developed that emerges from the Torah. But if you remember the scheme that I gave you, that's all called divrei sofrim. That's not actually what God gave at Sinai. That's the model of the Rambam. So for the Rambam, he had this very clear. What the Rambam gains, as we mentioned last time, is that he doesn't have to fight with the Karaites, because for him, the material that was actually given at Sinai is very small. It's the written law, which even the Karaites agree with, and it's the small levels, the small transmitted interpretation of specific passages in the written law. But the whole phalanx of laws and development that is at the heart of the rabbinic system is not something that was given at Sinai. And therefore, I don't have to make a far-reaching claim like the Gaonim did, that that's exactly what was given, so to speak, at Sinai. So that was the advantage of the Rambam. And in the middle, the Rambam also developed a theory, which was the theory, which again was based on the Sephardic tradition of his day, which is that a text means one thing. Text can't mean many things at the same time. And so therefore, for the Rambam, the text either means what it says, pshat, the plain sense of the text, or it means the authentic tradition which the rabbis say, but it's not that the text works on many different levels at the same time. And the Rambam took, for his purpose, the Rambam took the words, ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto, as meaning literally that the text does not leave ever what it means. Ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto. That's the approach of the Rambam. Okay.
So what does he make of the Parshanim?
So the Parshanim are trying to work to achieve what is pshat. And therefore, for example, if the rabbis offer an interpretation, for example, that doesn't fit into what he thinks is pshat, and is not actually one of those perushim hamekubalim that were transmitted from Sinai, it's not pshat. It's the rabbis developed this on their own. The rabbis are hooking it to the text. The rabbis are doing something else, but it's not what the text actually means. That is the approach of the Rambam. On the other hand, and that's what I'd like to start with today, the Ramban, Nachmanides, argued vigorously with the Rambam. And the Nachmanides, he took the position, very strong position, that the Rambam is misinterpreting the principle of Ein Mikra Yotzei Midei Pshuto. And again, I want to read him as follows. This is what the Ramban says. He starts off, again, I'll translate, and he says, the Rambam says, Ha'ikar asher ha'olinu bahem aleim ha'shalom, hu amram ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto. Veheyot l'shon ha'talmud mechapes b'chol makom, omer gufei dekra b'may mishtai. So the Rambam wants to bring us support for his interpretation. that the rabbis are always looking to find what the plain sense of the text is and not to go on flights of fancy what the text means. So the Ramban goes crazy. He says, V'chas v'shalom. Chas v'shalom, like we say today, chas v'shalom. God forbid that should be the correct way to interpret text. Ki ha-midrashim kulam b'inyan ha-mitzvot ein bahem mikra yotzei midei pshuto. The midrashim, they of course are not giving the plain sense of the text. Ela kulam bilashon hakatuv nichlalim. They are embedded in the language of the text. For the Ramban, a text does not mean one thing. A text can be multivocal. At the same time, kulam bilashon hakatuv nichlalim. They are all included in the text. Aval hakatuv yichlol hakol. Ki ein hapshat ki divrei chasrei dat halashon v'lo kedat hatzdukim. Ki sefer Torat Hashem tmima. The book of the Lord of God is complete, and it includes all these things. And the Ramban concludes with a very famous statement, which is actually what we today, most of us around the table and on the line and in general believe. Ramban says, V'hu ma'amaram ein hamikra yotzei midei pshuto. Notice carefully, says Ramban, when the rabbis formulated that statement, they did not say ein hamikra ela pshuto, that the text only has its plain meaning. What the text says is that after you've exhausted and derived all those things, the text still retains its pshat meaning. But that's not to come to exclude other meanings. Aval yesh lo midrash im pshuto. The midrash together with the pshat. Ve'eno yotzei midei kol echad mehem. And it does not remove either one of them. Aval yizbol hakatuv et hakol. The text can yizbol come from the language of patience. It can carry, it can hold within its text two separate meanings, equally valid on different planes of existence. And the text is a multivocal, multivalent text. And the question just is to uncover what the text means. To uncover what the text means. And the rabbis, when they come and they uncover it, they are uncovering they're not making a new, it's not a branch that is separate from the roots. They are uncovering the various rings of the roots, if we wanted to use that imagery. They are uncovering exactly what the text means, alongside whatever the plain sense of the text means. And here the Ramban is going for a different tradition. This is much closer to the Ashkenazi tradition, and he may have been influenced by Rashi and others who say the text speaks on multiple levels. There's Pshuto Shel Mikra, and there's Midrasho Shel Mikra, which is, all of them are legitimate. And this is a very, very important debate between the Ramban and Rashi. This is the first point that of the machloket between the Rambam and the Ramban that I wanted to mention. The second point comes back to another debate between the Rambam and the Ramban. Let me just find the correct text here. And this comes to the Ramban on Chumash. Ramban on Chumash, when he describes the category of lo tasur, of not to waver from the rabbinic interpretation. So the Ramban says as follows. Listen to this language. Ki ha-Torah this is in the Ramban's commentary on this is the Ramban's commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvot. So says the Ramban, Ki ha-Torah nitna lanu al yedei Moshe Rabbeinu bichtav. The Torah was given to us, v'galuihu, through Moses, shelo yishtavu hadeot b'chol hadvarim hanoladim. And it was clear that not everything that would arise, everyone would agree on interpretation. V'chatach lanu yitbarach hadin, and God cut, meaning God decreed, she'nishma lebeit din hagadol b'chol ma she'omru, that we should listen to the Beit Din Hagadol, the great court, bein she'ikablu perusho mimenu, whether the Beit Din is transmitting an authentic tradition that they heard back to their rabbis, back to Sinai, ala perushim hamekubalim of the Rambam, o she'omru kain mimashma'ut haTorah v'kavanatan lefi da'atam, or we should listen to them regarding their interpretation of the text and the meaning of the text as they understand it, using their logic and principles.
This is the Bet Di Sanhedrin.
Yes. And this is the key line here. Ki al hamashma'ut shalahem hu mitzaveh v'notein lanu et haTorah. God, this is an amazing line. God gave us the Torah predicated on their understanding of the Torah, on the rabbinic understanding of the Torah. This is what's called in law the constitutive conception of the law. That they come and what they tell you is the meaning of the Torah is what God meant all along. What God intended the Torah to mean. It's embedded in the text, and it's already there in the text, just waiting for you, i.e., the authorized guardians, custodians of the law, to uncover the meaning that's in the text. Ki al hamashma'ut shelahem hu mitzaveh v'notein lanu et haTorah. Al hamashma'ut shelahem. Based on their understanding, this is what we have to follow. And he quotes the famous rabbinic dictum, V'zeh ma she'amru, afilu omrim al smol shu yamin. Even if the rabbis tell you that left is right and right is left, shekachu hamitzvah lanu me'adon haTorah yitbarach. That is basically the constitutive element. What they tell you the text means is what the text means. Now the Rambam would say, what do you mean? What are you talking about? The text means one thing. The text can only mean what, so to speak, the right thing. Either because that's the plain sense of the text when there's no authentic tradition contradicting it, or when you have an authentic tradition.
When you talk about the rabbis,
He means the Sanhedrin.
at that time,
Or any other time, that if they are on the same, if they're in the same league,
but
they're
we
in
had
this,
no more Sanhedrin.
so then you can't do anything. You're stuck. That is part of the vicissitudes of history that limit our options and limit our ability to be flexible with the law. Correct.
It's
So
a
that-
Rose Bowl.
So that
Correct. In limited fashions, we do things. We work around the edges, but we don't reinterpret psukim today.
But so that's why in more modern times, we have so many streams of Judaism.
Correct. We certainly don't have any authority like the Sanhedrin, which is accepted by everybody. First of all, because, with the rise of the Enlightenment, the sense of being bound to the halachic system has become so attenuated and so weakened among so many people. And even amongst the more committed, you have so many debates because we don't have that, correct? With the loss of independence and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the Sanhedrin, all of that centralized structure went down the tubes.
never to be, reconstituted. And with exile and dispersion, it certainly was never once again. The Rambam tried. In his book, he says he hopes that people will read the text of the Torah and his book, and they'll know everything what to do and follow. And of course, there was a little bit of wishful thinking that would happen, and it didn't happen. The Rambam was not accepted as the final arbiter, except in very small circles. But the Ramban here is laying out a philosophical claim, very different than the Rambam, about the nature of halacha and how it develops. For the Rambam, there's this kind of objective truth that's passed on from generation to generation in a very small concentrate, and everything else that the rabbis do is a purely rabbinic enterprise, which should never be confused with the source. For the Ramban, in effect, what the rabbis uncover is what God meant all along, in effect. I want to put it in simplistic terms. Now, the Ramban here makes a far-reaching claim, which at first blush is very problematic, to say the least. He makes this reference to the statement that, I'll show you I'm right, because the rabbis say that even if the Sanhedrin says left is right or right is left, you have to listen to them, and you're not supposed to argue with them. So obviously they are telling you what the text actually means, and their interpretation is what the text means. It's not just their interpretation, it's what. So the problem with this, in effect what he's saying, if you think about it philosophically, what he's saying is that there's no such thing as error by the rabbis, by the Sanhedrin Haggadolah. Whatever, right? It's like the old debate in philosophy about, does God do that which is just and moral? Are God's commandments just and moral because they are just and moral, or whatever God says is just and moral is just and moral, right? So the same thing here. The Ramban basically is arguing that whatever the rabbis tell you is the meaning of the text is the meaning of the text. Going back,
That's Rambam.
That's Ramban, Nachmanides. Now, this is problematic because of the very first Mishnah in the Masechet in Shas called Horiot. There's a Masechet in Shas called Horiot, which deals with the psak of Beit Din Hagadol.
What is Horiot?
Horiot literally is the plural of lahorot, to teach. But here it means paskin. Like we say, a moreh hora'ah, someone who's able to give psak halacha, able to give rulings, to give a ruling. That's why the word moreh is a teacher, etc. So Torah, it's the same root, hora'ah.
Horim are parents.
Horim are parents, right? In terms of they raise up a generation. Now,
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So what did the
Ban.
Ramban think of the Midrash?
He thinks that the Midrash Halacha is an authentic representation of what this text means on that level. There's a level called Pshat, there's a level called Drash, there's different levels, and they both coexist together. When the rabbis said, Ein Mikra Yotzei Midei Pshuto, what the rabbis were saying is, don't think that the Midrash comes to exclude the existence of Pshat. For whatever reason, the Pshat still remains a live, viable interpretation, but it doesn't come to exclude the existence of a drash, which is as equally, if not more valid, as a reading of this text. So, the problem with the Ramban's claim here is the first Mishnah in Horiot says that if one of the members of the Beit Din, Haggadah, or a student who's reading over the case feels that who believes that the Beit Din made a mistake, that he is not supposed to listen to them. Okay? Now the question is when and where, etc., etc. So it sounds like they can make mistakes. The Gemara talks about
70 of them, isn't it?
Yeah, but the Gemara says that if you believe that if you're one of the members of the Beit Din, in certain instances, so the Ramban basically limits the authority of this Mishnah and basically says as follows.
Im haya bizman Sanhedrin chacham v'ra'ui lahora'ah. If there was in the time when there was a Beit Din Hagadol, there was a chacham, and he was ra'ui lahora'ah. He could pass. V'horu Beit Din Hagadol b'devar echad leheter. And the Beit Din Hagadol paskind leniently. They thought that this piece of meat is not treif, and it's really treif. V'hu sover sheta'u behoratan, ein alav mitzvah lishmoa. He doesn't have to listen to them. V'yesh alav lavo lifnehem v'lomar ta'anautav lahem. He has to come and bring his arguments to them. So the Ramban says this entire Mishnah is talking about prior to his bringing the arguments. But if he brings the arguments and they discuss it with him, v'im hiskimu rubam bevitul hadatahu she'amar v'shibshu alav svarotav yachazor v'yinhag keda'atam umikom makom chayav lekabel da'atam achar hahaskama al kol panim. So basically what the Ramban says is he introduces tot, but only if once he's brought the argument to their attention, then he has to listen to them. But prior to that, he shouldn't listen to them because they haven't heard his argument. And so there could be mistaken because they haven't heard all facets of the case. They haven't heard all the situations of the case. And therefore, in that situation, you have to, before that, you have to, follow your own conscience. But after that, you have to, so to speak, you have to follow them. But meaning, once they've discussed it, they've gone back and forth with your arguments, and they've come to that conclusion. What the rabbis decide is what the meaning of the text is. Is what the meaning of the text is. Now, this approach, in a more, so to speak, in an easier fashion, not easier fashion, but in a very famous passage, this comes down to us in a very famous comment of some of the subsequent rabbis in Sfarad, in a very, very famous discussion about the principle of, let me just see. One second. Let me just read to you one more passage from the Ramban. Again, I'm sorry, a little bit. The Ramban, in his commentary to Chumash, his commentary on Chumash, on the pasuk of Lo Tasur Asher Yagidu Lecha Yaminu Smol, which is where that image comes from. You should not deviate from what the rabbis tell you to the left and to the right. So says Ramban, again, I'm going to translate. Afilu im omer lecha yamin shu smol, or smol shu yamin. That's the quote from the rabbis. V'inyano. What does it mean? Afilu tachshov belibcha, even if you think shehem toim v'hadavar pashut beinecha, even if you think that they're making a mistake, and it's obvious to you, kasher ata yodea ben yamincha l'smolcha, just like a person knows the difference between his right and his left, unless you're a little kid and you get mixed up. Ta'aseh kemitzvatam, you should definitely follow their command. The al tomar, and don't say ech ochal ha'chelav hagamor. How can I eat this forbidden fat when I know that the rabbis got this wrong? They think this is kosher, and it's really treif. O eherog ha'ishan hakiyazeh. Aval tomar kach tziva oti ha'adon hamitzaveh al hamitzvot. But rather, accept upon yourself that this is what God, who commands me all the mitzvot, told me to listen. She'aseh b'chol mitzvotav kechol asher yoruni ha'omdim lefanav b'makom asher yivchar. I should follow whatever they say when they are in the place which God has chosen. V'al mashma'ut da'atam natan li ha-Torah. And God gave me the Torah based upon their understanding of the law.
They are the ones who tell you that this is the law. There's a famous comment of Samuel Johnson about the classic authors. They're right. They're final because they're right, and they're right because they're final. So, in a sense, it's both. They have the authority, but they're also right because they were given the authority to interpret, to give the authentic interpretation of what the text means.
When was the end of the Sanhedrin?
So that's a good question. When it ended entirely, it seems to be resurrected somewhat after the Churban, after the destruction. Right? We have the Mishnayot that talk about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in Yavne, and we have Usha, and there seems to have been in the Galil. There seems to have been a period after the destruction of the temple when the Sanhedrin was still functioning. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they had all the functions that they had, like the ability to kill people and the ability to collect money. It seems that, but at a certain point, I can't tell you an exact date. On this date, it stopped functioning. I can't tell you that, but it seems that it certainly kept functioning post-Churban, but how much longer, 100 years, 200 years? I mean, I'm sure there are scholars who discuss this
So
in
it
great...
wasn't here for the Second Temple?
No, I'm talking about the Second Temple. I'm talking about the destruction. Even after the destruction of the Second Temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the famous, Tein li Yavne v'chachamea, give me Yavne and its scholars, reconstitutes the Sanhedrin in some form, and makes takanot, establishes, all kinds of rules and laws to help Judaism survive. And, again, and many of the debates seem to continue and be adjudicated. So there certainly seems to be Sanhedrin, how far into, the time, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, certainly the Jews in Bavel didn't have a Sanhedrin because they couldn't, the Sanhedrin has to be in Jerusalem, in the temple, to have that kind of authority. Or in Eretz Yisrael, if they can't get to Jerusalem. We don't seem to find the Sanhedrin outside of the land of Israel. So certainly when you could say, if you want to, make a cutoff point, maybe right after the writing of the Mishnah, in the, 220, 230, right after that, the Sanhedrin as a really functioning body seems to end. Yes?
Thank you.
Napoleon tried to resurrect the Sanhedrin.
Correct. Napoleon went, this is what they call the Napoleonic Sanhedrin, where he went to a group of leading rabbis and basically put them on the spot in order, but they were not, it wasn't of their own free will. He asked them a series of questions. In France, yes, when Napoleon took over France. So there he kind of forced them into certain...
But it never materialized.
No, it was never accepted. Just like, look, when the State of Israel was created, Rav Maimon, who was one of the leading, one of the leaders of the Mizrahi movement at the time, and was a scholar himself, tried to resurrect the Sanhedrin, and it didn't go anywhere. One of the reasons why the Haredim of the time were so opposed to the chief rabbinate was because they thought it was the beginning of trying to create a Sanhedrin that would impose its will on all of Jewry and start to try to do things that they didn't think were appropriate and take for themselves authority that they didn't think was appropriate. But that was one of the reasons. There was a big fight about Heichal Shlomo. Today, nobody goes to Heichal Shlomo. Is a little, no, it's not there anymore, the chief rabbinate. But yeah, when they were building Heichal Shlomo, there was a tremendous fight about it. Because again, the Haredim were very opposed to this notion of setting up a central body that would try to control.
That's Rehavia.
It's opposite the,
right up
I guess
to
it's
that
Rehavia.
hotel.
Yeah, right next to the King's Hotel.
Yeah.
Yes, correct. But you went to the great big synagogue, right? But next to the great big synagogue is an old building called Heichal Shlomo, which was once the seat of the chief rabbinate. And then it had many Gilgulim. There's a little museum in there, and then there was a restaurant in there. And now there's a shul in there? Okay. Yeah, okay. Right, correct. There's a little shul there. I davened there a few times, right. So again, the Ramban uses the same language that he used in the Sefer HaSharashim. So the Ramban says, "V'al tomar eich uchal ha'chelev o eharog." How can I eat this which I think is chelev, which I think is forbidden fat? Or how can I kill this person based on the psak of the Sanhedrin if I think he's innocent? Aval tomar kach tzivauti Adon mitzavel mitzvot she'aseh b'chol mitzvot. He commanded me to follow whatever these rabbis tell me to do. Va'al mashma'ut da'atam natan li haTorah afilu yitu. And I am supposed to follow. They are the ones who are authorized to give me, as the, like the authorized translation. They are the ones who. And he continues, and he says he gave us this Torah, and he says, otherwise there would be constant machloket and constant schisms, and everyone would make up their own Torah. V'chatach lanu hakatuv hadin shenishma lebatei din hagadol. B'chol ma she'omru lanu b'ferush haTorah o b'chavanata ki al hadat shelahem hu notein lahem haTorah. He gave the Torah based on their understanding. They are the ones who shape and line the contours of what the Torah means. Very different image than the Rambam. It's not that there's some objective thing that was given and then they have the right to flower it and develop it and make up their own new laws that have authority, but are really branches. No, these are the roots. What the rabbis tell you are the roots. And they, to use the rabbinic phrase, lemafreya. What do lemafreya means? In retrospect, when they tell you this is what it means all along. Lemafreya, looking in hindsight, when the rabbis in the Sanhedrin say, this is what the pasuk means, well, that's what it really meant all along, because that was inherent in the text, and they just brought out to us. And this is made explicit in a very famous comment of the Ritva, who was one of the students of the Rambam. The Ritva comments on the very famous phrase, which we often hear, especially when there's debate. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, right? It's a famous Gemara in Eruvin. Right. That's one idea, that we try to find everything in the Torah. And then the second idea is, even when you have very extreme debates, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Now what does that mean? Elu ve'elu divrei, isn't one right and one wrong? Meaning, what does it mean? Either you light Hanukkah candles from starting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or Beit Shammai's, right? And you go 8, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. It was only Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. And that's a bad example because that's a derabanan. But either a sukkah, the drasha is it should have 3 walls and a little bit, or it should have 2 walls and a little bit. So which is right? So on a practical level, you have to determine. So the Ritva says as follows: Sha'alu Rabbanei Tzarfat. They asked the rabbis of Tzarfat, of the French rabbis, which again tells you the Sephardic rabbis of the Rambam, and they took a different, but the northern French, the French rabbis who affected the Ramban. Remember, the Ramban lived in Spain.
Corona.
Right, he lived in Spain, but he also and his students eventually went to Provence, and there was a relationship. So it says, Shalu Rabbanei Tzarfat, Heichav Shar Shiu Shneim Divrei Elokim Chayim. How is it possible that both of the words are living God? V'zeh oser v'zeh matir. This one says it's mutter, and this one says it's aser. It's either one or the other. V'tirtzu. And they answered, K'she'alam Moshe lamarom lekabel Torah. When Moshe went up on high to receive the Torah, Her'ulo al kol davar v'davar. They showed him the potentiality of understanding this same text 49 ways. Memtet panim le'isur u'memtet panim. The proverbial 49 ways. And the rabbis, 49 is the kind of symbolic. The 49 ways to read this le'isur, that it should be stringent, and 49 ways to read it leheter. V'shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu al zeh. And then Moshe asked God, so what do I do? Ve'amar sheyehei zeh masur lechachmei Yisrael shebechol dor vador. And this would be given to the generations, the rabbis in each generation, to choose amongst these all legitimate interpretations of the text. V'yeh kimotam. And the decision would be following this approach. Now this, of course,
is a very different conception of machloket, very different conception of why there's debate. There's debate because inherent in the text, there are multiple layers of meaning and different avenues you could choose. And this fits in with a piece with the Ramban. The Ramban in his introduction to one of his commentaries called Milchamot Hashem, he writes how, it's not like math or science where there's absolute knockout proofs. When it comes to the world of learning, you have a proof this way, which you can say this way, depending on how you interpret this text. You can limit this text, you can limit that text, meaning for the Ramban, there's no absolute, because they're all potentially true. Because from the very outset, this text is a multivalent text. Yeah, it's a very, very daring, in a certain sense, interpretation in terms of this idea. And that each one of them has, so to speak, objective truth, a kind of truth context to them. Now, this, of course,
so
yeah.
Can one Sanhedrin then contradict a previous Sanhedrin, and that's okay?
Yeah, and because that's part of the rules of the game. That another Sanhedrin later on, if it's equal in number and strength, or better, has the right to adopt the other potential reading of this text as a legitimate as a legitimate reading.
How does Kabbalah, because a lot of his parushim,
so
in Kabbalah.
Right. So some people have argued that this actually fits in with a piece to the Kabbalistic superstructure of the Ramban, because the Ramban in his introduction to Chumash says that he talks about the different levels of interpretation that he's going to write in this commentary, and he says at one point that actually the Torah is actually, if you put it together, is all names of God. He actually says that, Shemot Ha'el. And so this fits in with that idea that the text, if it's really the names of God, then there's a lot of stuff going on. And if God is the author of everything, and the Baal, etc., so then this text has in it a tremendous plasticity, a tremendous valence of different interpretations that are possible. And
but that's a very difficult thing to apply to a society.
I agree with you, and that's why on the practical level, the Ramban will argue, and he hints at it in a number of places, that the Sanhedrin, in effect, is driven, has an almost kind of Ruach HaKodesh, has an almost kind of divine inspiration that is driving it. The gap between halacha and prophecy in the world of the Ramban is much less than it is in the world of the Rambam. For the Rambam, prophecy has absolutely no role in the actual adjudication of halacha, which is part of the story of Lo Bashamayim Hi, etc., etc. For the Ramban, it's different. For him, there can be some role to be played by prophecy in the world of the interpretation.
So Ramban was more of a mystic?
Definitely. The Ramban wrote in his commentary, he was from Gerona, he was a mystic, and he was very much affected by the mysticism of the time, and he wrote a number of mystical works, and in his commentary on Chumash, he writes a commentary that everyone can understand, but in very often he'll says Val derech ha'emet, and by the way of truth, which is his code word for this is not for you and me, it's not for the uninitiated. For the initiated, he says, I will write in hints, and they will figure out what I'm driving at, because he was transmitting Kabbalah, the Kabbalah that he knew, in interpreting the biblical text. So in effect, yes, I'm sorry.
The Ramban certainly couldn't have been an important figure in something like the forming of our Constitution for a people to live by.
Why?
Because you're right, and you're right, and you're right.
Yeah, but the Ramban doesn't deny that the system set up a vehicle by which to adjudicate which is the interpretation by which we will live by. We will live by this, by the majority rule. But Beit Shammai could theoretically be a legitimate, correct interpretation of the text, and in a different generation it will be recovered
and brought, because it's never rejected fully in the sense of, it's not wrong in the sense of, it is a potential reading of the text that exists in potentia. And if the Sanhedrin had adopted it, this would be what God's will was, that this should be how the Torah should be interpreted.
So lots of people say, well, times are different today from what they were.
Right.
And we can do this and we can do that, and this sort of thing, because times have changed.
Right. So the Ramban would say, but you still have one major obstacle, and that is you still need the instrument of change, which was authorized by God, and that's called the Sanhedrin.
But we
Just
don't
like
have
in our
Sanhedrin.
correct, just like in America too. In America too, even our Constitution, even if you and I and 10 other people in this room think that with some law or some of the amendments of the Constitution, like let's say a lot of people think the Second Amendment is a stupid amendment today. Maybe it made sense in the time when there was muskets and militias and the British. But today, that everybody should have a right to have a gun is stupid, right? You and I can think that from here to tomorrow. You and I can't change the Constitution unless a very high bar, right? It has to be 3/4 of the state legislature and the 3/4 of the Congress, right? Whatever the rules are. Doesn't mean that we're wrong. We could be right. But practically, the world, the government is going to live by the Constitution as it's written until it's changed. And so the same thing, in a certain sense, an analogy. We live by the decisions of the Sanhedrin, codified and passed on, even if there might be a better reading, but one day maybe that better reading will be resurrected when there's a Sanhedrin. That's why it is so critical that one day the Sanhedrin be resurrected as an instrument of the flexibility.
How are they conceived in today's?
So today we don't have that, and that's why there's a whole body of law that we don't touch today. There's a whole body of law that we don't in any way, shape, or form touch.
Korbanot?
No, I'm saying even when it comes to non-korbanot, even not related to there's certain things that we don't have the ability to touch or change, which we might have wanted to, okay? But that reaches a whole other level. Other laws also we don't,
Can I tell you a story over at
Sure.
Galachat? The Ramaz, Rabbi Margolis, Rabbi Joseph Lipstein told this story.
Right.
A woman came to him Erev Shabbat
right.
with a chicken. Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? He said, let me get a sefer. And he got a sefer, and he looked at another sefer. He said, it's kosher, you can have it. She left, and someone who was there said, Rabbi, it was not kosher. He said, I know, but she's a poor woman, and she would not have had what to eat on Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
That was that.
Right. So he found some leniency.
He found it out of Rahmanut.
Right. I mean, that was driving him, but I assume he found some leniency, and which we do. And the legal system is very differential, depending on the context. Like b'shat hadchak, there's a principle in Jewish law that when it's a difficult situation, you can rely on opinions that you might not rely on in normal situations. Exactly. Well, that's part of what the calculus of a good rabbi is. But again, we're not changing the law. We're applying the law to a specific situation. To change law from and reinterpret what a pasuk means, for that you need a Sanhedrin. And that's what we've in these 4 sessions, what we explored was the origin of the written law and what God commanded and gave over to the Jewish people through Moshe, as well as directly through his word to the Jewish people. We then went into the concept of the oral law. What exactly do we believe was given at Sinai? How much of the oral law was given at Sinai? And different theories. We went into the Gaonic theory, we went into the Rambam theory, we went into the Ramban theory. These are the major theories that are out there within Jewish tradition, within Jewish, classic Jewish